On the Anarchist Society Conversation with Peter J. Noam Chomsky. He has been an American linguist, philosopher, political scientist, and activist. Emeritus Professor of Linguistics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. On the Anarchist Society Conversation with Peter J. Peter J. Professor Chomsky, to begin with, perhaps it would be best if you tried to tell us what is not to be understood by anarchism. The word anarchy, as is known, comes from the Greek and literally means without government, but I suppose that those who speak of anarchy or anarchism as a system of political philosophy do not simply mean that they are in favor of starting on January 19, next year, say, all government as we understand it today will suddenly cease to exist and that there will no longer be police or traffic regulations, laws, or tax collectors, or even postal, telephone, and telegraph services, etc. I imagine that with those words they understand something more complicated than all that. Chomsky, well, let's understand each other. I say yes to some of your questions and no to others. Most likely, the defenders of anarchy or anarchism are in favor of no police, but not that they should dispense with traffic regulations. I would like to start by saying that the term anarchism encompasses a large number of political ideas and that I prefer to understand it as the left of any libertarian movement. From these positions we could conceive anarchism as a kind of voluntary socialism, that is, as a libertarian socialism, or as anarcho-syndicalism, or as a libertarian communism or communist anarchism, according to the tradition of Bakunin, Kropotkin, and others. These two great thinkers proposed a highly organized form of society, albeit organized on the basis of organic units or organic communities. Generally, by these two expressions they understood the workshop and the neighborhood, and from this pair of organic units derive, through federal agreements, a highly integrated social organization that could have national and international scope. Every decision, at all levels, would have to be taken by a majority on the ground, and all the delegates representing each organic community must be part of it and must come from it, to which they must return and in which, in fact, they live. Peter J. So it's not a society where there is literally no government, but rather a society where the main direction of authority comes from below. Contrary to representative democracies such as those that exist in the United States and Great Britain that adopt a top-down form of authority, although ultimately the voters decide. Chomsky, that American or British representative democracy is criticized by an anarchist for two reasons. Firstly, because a monopoly of centralized power is exercised in the state, and, secondly, critically speaking, because representative democracy is limited to the political sphere without consistently extending its character to the economic field. The anarchists of the tradition to which we allude have always believed that control over one's productive life is the sine qua non of all true human liberation, indeed of all meaningful democratic practice. In other words, as long as there are citizens who are obliged to rent in the labor market to those who are interested in employing them for their businesses, as long as the function of the producer is limited to being a subordinate tool, there will be frankly scandalous coercive and oppressive elements that do not invite, much less to speak in such conditions of democracy, if it still makes sense to do so. Peter J. Does history give lasting examples and of any somewhat substantial scale of societies that have approximated the anarchist ideal? Chomsky, yes, there have been quantitatively small societies that I think have been quite successful in realizing that ideal, apart from the fact that history gives examples of large-scale libertarian revolution with a mainly anarchist structure. But going back to the first, I personally believe that perhaps the most dramatic example is that of the Israeli kibbutzim, which for a long period were really governed by anarchist principles, that is, self-management, direct control of the workers in all the management of the company, integration of agriculture, industry, and services, as well as personal participation and provision in self-government. I dare say that they were extraordinarily successful in almost all the measures that had to be imposed. P.J. But surely these kibbutzim were, and still are, framed within the framework of a traditional state that guarantees them a certain fundamental stability. Chomsky, it hasn't always been that way. The history of the kibbutzim is quite interesting in this regard. Only since 1948 are they geared to the machinery of a conventional state. Before, they only obeyed the imperatives of a colonial enclave and, in reality, there was an underlying society, mostly cooperative, which in fact was not part of the superstructural system of the British Mandate, but rather operated surreptitiously outside the scope of this mandate. And even to a certain extent, that cooperative society survived the founding of the State of Israel, but naturally it ended up becoming part of it, thus losing, in my opinion, a large part of its libertarian socialist character in the region of the Israeli kibbutzim, for of the political process that the very foundation of a nation entailed, in addition to other processes entailed by the history of the region in its international conjuncture that there is no reason to deal with here. However, as functioning libertarian socialist institutions, I think that the Israeli kibbutzim can pass for an interesting model and highly appropriate for advanced industrial societies to the extent that other examples existing in the past are not. A good example of a really large-scale anarchist revolution, in fact the best example I know of, is that of the Spanish Revolution of 1936, during which, and in most of Republican Spain, an anarchist, or eminently inspired by, revolution took place. In anarchism, which included both the organization of agriculture and of industry to considerable extents, having further developed in a manner which, at least seen from the outside, gives every impression of spontaneity. But if we look for the deepest roots and its origins, we realize that this result is due to some 3 generations of self-sacrificing militants ceaselessly organizing, experimenting, thinking, and working to spread anarchist ideas among vast layers of the population in that eminently pre-industrial society, although not quite pre-industrial. This experience was also very successful, both from the point of view of human conditions and economic measures. It means that production continued its course with even more efficiency. The farm and factory workers proved to be perfectly capable of managing things and managing themselves without any pressure from above, contrary to what many socialists, communists, liberals, and other citizens of Republican Spain, not to mention the Spanish Republic, had imagined. Another, and, frankly, who knows what game this experience could have given for the well-being and freedom of the world. Unfortunately, that anarchist revolution was destroyed by brute force, despite the fact that while it was in force it was successful without http://galleon.hispavista.com/bvchomsky/textos/anar01.html, 2 of 13, 29/11/2002 18 hours 58 minutes and 32 seconds on the preceding anarchist society and on having been, I repeat, a very inspiring testimony in many respects to the ability of poor working people to organize and manage their affairs in a fully successful way without oppression or controls external or superior. However, to what extent the Spanish experience is applicable to highly industrialized societies is a question that should be investigated in detail. Peter J. What appears clear to everyone is that the fundamental idea of anarchism is anchored in the priority of the individual, not necessarily isolated, but precisely together with other individuals and the realization of their freedom. This sounds to us like what the founders of the United States proclaimed. What has happened to the American experience that has made that freedom invoked by that tradition a suspicious and even corrupted word in the ears of anarchist thinkers and libertarian socialists like yourself? Chomsky, let me make it clear first of all that I do not consider myself an anarchist thinker. Let's say that I am a fellow traveler by derivation, of anarchism. Anarchist thinkers have always expressed themselves very favorably about the American experience and the ideal of Jeffersonian democracy. You already know that for Jefferson the best government is the one that governs the least, or the apostille to this thorough aphorism according to which the best government is the one that governs nothing at all. Both formulaic phrases have been repeated by anarchist thinkers on every occasion and through time since the anarchist doctrine has existed. Jeffersonian democracy, leaving aside the fact that it was still a society with slaves, developed within a pre-capitalist system, that is, in a society in which no monopoly was in control and there were no important pockets of power. Private It is really amazing to read some classic libertarian texts today. Reading, for example, The Critique of the State, 1791, by Wilhelm von Humboldt, a very significant work that surely inspired Mill, one realizes that it does not speak at all about the need to oppose the concentration of private power. And rather it is about the need to counteract the usurpation of the coercive power of the state. The same is true in the early American tradition. Why? Simply because that was the only kind of power there was. I mean that von Humboldt assumed that every individual possessed more or less a similar degree of power, but private power, and that the only real imbalance was within the centralized and authoritarian state, and that freedom had to be protected against all intervention by the state and the church. This is what he believed had to be combated. However, when he speaks to us, for example, of the need to exercise control over one's own creative life, when he curses against alienation by work, resulting from coercion or simply from instructions or direction in the work of each one, instead of act by self-management, then it reveals its anti-state and anti-theocratic ideology. But the same principles apply to the capitalist industrial society that was formed later. I am inclined to believe that von Humboldt, had he persisted in his ideological quest, would have ended up being a libertarian socialist. Peter J., doesn't all of this background suggest that there is something inherent in the pre-industrial state in all that concerns the applicability of libertarian ideas? In other words, that libertarian ideas necessarily presuppose a basically rural society with fairly simple technology and production and whose economic organization tends to be small-scale and localized. Chomsky, let's separate your question into two questions. First, what have the anarchists thought about it, and second, how do I think? When it comes to anarchist responses, we have at least two. In the first place, there is an anarchist tradition, which we could start from a Kropotkin, with the character that you have just described. But in the second place, there is another anarchist tradition that, as it develops, leads to anarcho-syndicalism and that sees in anarchism the adequate way to organize a complex society with a highly advanced industrial level. And this trend within anarchism is confused, or at least very closely related, to a variety of leftist Marxism of the sort of Spartacist communists, for example, coming out of the Rosa Luxemburg tradition and later represented by Marxist theorists. As Anton Pannekoek, who developed a whole theory about the workers' councils in industry, being himself a man of science, an astronomer. As well, which of these two points of view is the one that fits the truth? Or in other words, do anarchist concepts have as their object a pre-industrial society exclusively, or is anarchism also a suitable conception to apply to the organization of a highly advanced industrial society? Personally, I believe in the second option, that is, I believe that industrialization and the advancement of technology have closed with them possibilities for self-management on a vast terrain that had never before been presented. I believe, in fact, that anarcho-syndicalism gives us precisely the most rational model of an advanced and complex industrial society in which the workers can perfectly take charge of their own affairs in a direct and immediate way, that is, direct and control them, without that for that reason they are not capable at the same time of occupying key positions in order to make the most substantial decisions about the economic structure, social institutions, regional and super-regional planning, etc. Currently, the governing institutions do not allow workers to exercise any control over the information necessary in the production process, nor do they otherwise have the training required to understand these management issues. On the other hand, in a society without vested interests or monopolies, much of that work, administrative included, could already be done automated. It is common knowledge that machines can fulfill a large percentage of the labor tasks that today are carried out by workers, and that, therefore, once a high standard of living is mechanically assured, they could freely undertake any work of creation that previously it would have been objectively impossible for them to even imagine, especially in the early phase of the Industrial Revolution. Peter J. Next, I would like to attack the problem of the economy in an anarchist society, but could you paint us in a little more detail the political constitution of an anarchist society as you imagine it in the modern conditions of life today? It occurs to me to ask, for example, if political parties would exist in that society and what residual forms of government would continue to exist in practice. Chomsky, let me outline what I think might roughly elicit a consensus among libertarians, an outline that naturally seems to me essentially, though minimally, correct for the case. Starting with the two kinds of organization and control, namely, organization and control in the workplace and in the community, we could thus imagine a network of workers' councils and, at a higher level, inter-factory, or inter-industry representation of industry and commerce, or between trades and professions, and so on up to the general assemblies of the workers' councils emanating from the base at the regional, national, or international level. And from the other point of view, or on the other side, it is possible to imagine a system of government based on local assemblies, in turn federated regionally and dealing with regional matters, with the exception of what concerns trades, industry and commerce, etc., to later move to the national level and to the Confederation of Nations, etc. However, how exactly these structures should be developed and what their interrelation would be, or whether both are necessary or just one, are questions that anarchist theorists have discussed and on which there are many variants. For now, I dare not take sides, these are questions that will have to be elaborated and elucidated thoroughly and calmly. Peter J. But wouldn't there be, for example, direct national elections, or organized end-to-end political parties, as it were? Of course, if this were the case, some kind of central authority would possibly be created, which would be contrary to the anarchist idea. Chomsky, no, well, the anarchist idea favors that the delegation of authority be the minimum possible expression and that the participants, at any level, of the government should be directly controlled by the organic community in which they live. The optimal situation would be, then, that participation at any level of government is only partial, that is to say, that the members of a workers' council who, in fact, exercise their functions by making decisions that the other workers do not have time to make, at the same time continue to do their work in the pit, workshop, or factory in which they are employed, or their work or mission in the community, neighborhood, or social group to which they belong. And regarding political parties, my opinion is that an anarchist society does not necessarily have to prohibit them. Since, in fact, anarchism has always been based on the idea that any Procrustean bed, any normative system imposed on social life must constrain and markedly impair its energy and vitality and that, rather, all kinds of new possibilities for voluntary organization may appear at a higher level of material and intellectual culture. But I sincerely believe that if the existence of political parties is deemed necessary, the anarchist society will have failed. I want to say that, in my view, in a situation with direct participation in self-government and self-management of economic and social affairs, dissensions, conflicts, differences of interests, ideas, and opinions tended to be not only welcomed, but even cultivated, to be duly expressed at each of the different levels. I don't see why these differences should coincide with parties that are not created from differences, but to create them precisely. I don't think the complexity of human interest and life is better served by dividing it that way. In reality, the parties fundamentally represent class interests, and classes should have been eliminated or superseded in a society like the one we are dealing with. Peter J. One last question about political organization. With this hierarchical series of assemblies and a quasi-governmental structure, without direct elections, isn't there a danger that the central body or the body that is at the top of the pyramid, as it were, moves too far from the base and that if it has powers in international affairs, for example, it could even dispose of armed forces or other instruments of violence and that, in the end, it would be less watched than a government is in today's parliamentary democracies? Chomsky, it is a condition of the first importance in any libertarian society to prevent such a course in national and international public affairs, and to that end the necessary institutions must be created. Which I think is perfectly doable. Personally, I am convinced that participation in government is not a full-time job. It can be in an irrationally governed society in which all kinds of problems are caused by the very irrationality of the institutions. But in an advanced industrial society functioning properly through libertarian channels, I imagine that the implementation of the decisions made by the representative bodies is a part-time occupation that would have to be carried out in turn within each community, and that it should also demand as a condition that those who exercise it not abandon their own professional activities, even in part. Suppose it were possible to understand the government as a business function equivalent to the production of steel, for example. If that were feasible, and I believe that it is a question of empirical facts that have to obey their own determinations and that cannot be projected as pure theory. If that were feasible, I say, the natural consequence would be to organize the government industrially, as if it were one more branch of the industry, with its own workers' council and its own self-managing discipline and its own participation in the assemblies of greater extension or scope. I might add here that this was the case in the spontaneously formed workers' councils in some places, as for example in the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. There was in effect, if I am not mistaken, a council of state employees who had organized themselves simply on the basis of the industrial or business manner as other branches of industry of traditional type. Such a thing is perfectly possible and would have to be, or could be, a barrier that would prevent the formation of that kind of remote repressive bureaucracy that anarchists fear so much, naturally. Peter J., assuming that some need for self-defense continued to exist at a fairly sophisticated level, I do not understand from your description of anarchist society how effective control could be exercised by such a part-time representative council system, and even at various levels below. Above, on an organization as powerful and technically perfected by the force of things as the Pentagon, for example. Chomsky, okay, let's get the terminology a little bit precise. You speak of the Pentagon as a defensive organization, which is the norm. In 1947, when the National Defense Law was approved, the former Ministry of War, as it had been honestly called, was renamed the Department of Defense. At that time I was still a student and I didn't think I was very well versed in the matter, but I knew, like everyone else, that if the U.S. Army up to then could have been involved in the defense of the nation, and it had been partially so in henceforth, the Department of Defense would no longer be more than a ministry of aggression, and nothing more. Peter J., on the principle that nothing is to be believed until it is officially denied. Chomsky, exactly. A little under the assumption with which Orwell had essentially conceived the modern state and its nature. And this is exactly the case. I want to say that the Pentagon is in no way the instrument of the Ministry of Defense. It has never defended the United States against anyone, and the only thing it has produced has been aggression. That is why I believe that the American people would be much better off without the Pentagon than with it. But in any case, you don't need it for your defense. His intervention in international affairs has never been, well, it's never too much to say, but it would be difficult to find an exception, his position or characteristic attitude of supporting freedom or defending the people. This is not the role played by the vast military organization that controls the Department of Defense. Their tasks are rather two very different and both quite antisocial. The first is to safeguard an international system in which so-called U.S. interests, by which is meant primarily business interests, continue to flourish. The second task fulfills an international economic mission. Hence, the Pentagon has been the most important Keynesian mechanism by which the government intervenes to maintain what is comically called the health of the economy by inciting production, that is, by leading to wasteful production. Now, both functions serve certain interests, indeed dominant interests, dominant class interests in American society. But I don't think they serve the public interest too little or much, and such a system of wasteful production and destruction would be essentially dismantled in a libertarian society. But don't talk too much about these things. If we imagine, for example, a social revolution in the United States, something that is very far away, I would say but if this were to happen, it is difficult to imagine that there would be a real enemy of force capable of threatening the country's social revolution, Mexico or Cuba, for example, were not going to attack us. I do not believe, then, that a revolution in the United States needed to defend itself against foreign aggression. Whereas if a social revolution were proclaimed in Western Europe, I believe that in such a case the problem of defense would acquire critical characters. PJ, I was going to tell you that surely lack of self-defense cannot be inherent in the anarchist idea, since until now all anarchist experiments have been annihilated from the outside. Chomsky, now, what happens is that these questions cannot be answered more than specifically and always in relation to concrete historical cases and in objective conditions. Peter J. No, it's just that I had a hard time understanding what you were saying about proper democratic control for that kind of organization, since it seems very unlikely to me that the generals would control themselves in the way that you see fit. Chomsky, the difficulty is that I want to point out the complexity of the issue. It all depends on the country and the society in question. A specific class of problems arises in the United States. If the libertarian social revolution is declared in Europe, I think that then the problems that would arise would be very serious, since a great defense problem would immediately arise. Because I suppose that if a libertarian socialism of a certain scope were achieved in Western Europe, it would be surrounded by an imminent military threat from two sides, from the Soviet Union and from the United States. Then the first problem would be how to defend yourself. With this problem the Spanish Revolution had to face. Because it was not only threatened in situ by fascist military intervention, but also by communist armed units and by liberal enemies from the rear and from neighboring nations. Faced with such magnitude and number of attacks, the problem of defense was the most serious, as it was life or death. Despite all this, I think the question must be asked whether the best way to do it is based on centralized armies with all their dissuasive technology. The truth, I do not think that the thing is so drawer. For example, I don't think that a centralized Western European army would prevent a Russian or American attack in order to put down a libertarian socialism, because the kind of attack I would expect, frankly, would not be perhaps military, but economic at least. Peter J. But on the other hand, the classic riots of peasants armed with pitchforks and sickles are not to be expected anymore. Chomsky, we are not talking about peasants, but about industrially developed and highly urbanized societies. It occurs to me that their best weapon would be to attract the sympathy of the working classes of the attacking countries. But I repeat that you have to be careful. And it is not at all unlikely that the revolution needed tanks, an army, and thus brought about its own undoing for the above reasons. In other words, I think it is very difficult to imagine how a central army with its tanks, planes, and strategic weapons could function in a revolutionary regime. And if that is necessary to save the revolutionary structures, woe to the revolution. Peter J. If the best method of defense is, as you say, to win the sympathy of political and economic organizations, perhaps it would be appropriate to go into more detail on this point. In one of your essays you say that in a decent society, everyone would have the opportunity to find an interesting job and everyone would be allowed to use their talents by being offered the widest opportunities for the same object. Then he wonders, and what more would it take? Perhaps an external reward in the form of luxuries or power. That is in case we suppose that making use of one's talents in interesting and socially useful work does not reward us by itself. I think this way of reasoning pleases many people. But it still needs some explanation. Personally, I believe that the work that people may find interesting or attractive or satisfying does not necessarily have to coincide with the kind of work that has to be done out of necessity, if we want to maintain the standard of living that people demand and are accustomed to. Chomsky, indeed, there is a lot of work that has to be done if we want to maintain the current standard of living. The question remains to be answered, to what extent does this work have to be onerous? Let us remember that neither science nor technology nor the simple intellect have dedicated themselves to examining the question in order to abolish the heavy and self-destructive character of some necessary jobs in our society. This is due to the fact that there has always been a sizable body of hired slaves in reserve who will do any job, no matter how hard, rather than starve. But if human intelligence were applied to solve the problem of how to make the heavier jobs that society requires tolerable, we don't know what the way out would be. I have for me that much of that work could be made totally tolerable. This apart from the fact that it seems to me a mistake to believe that all physically hard work has to be onerous. There are a lot of people, myself included, who take on hard jobs to relax. Not long ago, for example, it occurred to me to plant 34 trees in a meadow behind my house, which meant digging 34 holes. Considering what I normally do as a job, that's pretty heavy work, but I have to confess I enjoyed doing it. However, I am sure he would not have enjoyed having to do it with a foreman in front and fixed hours, etc. Although if it is a task taken out of interest it can also be done. And without technologies, without thinking about how to plan the work, etc. Peter J., to this I could tell you that there is a danger that this way of seeing the problem is a rather romantic illusion, only possible for a small elite of intellectuals, professors, journalists, etc. That they are in the privileged situation of being paid for what they like to do and would do in other ways. Chomsky, that's why I started by putting a big if in front. I said that first we must ask ourselves to what extent the work necessary for society, that is, the work required to maintain the standard of living that we want, must necessarily be heavy or onerous. I think the answer would be, much less than it is today, but let's agree that to some extent it remains dirty. Even so, the answer is very simple, that dirty work must be distributed equally among all those who are capable of doing it. Peter J., so each of us spends a certain number of months a year on the car production line and the same number collecting garbage or other thankless tasks. Chomsky, if indeed these are tasks of impossible self-satisfaction. But I don't think so, frankly. When I see workers at work, let's say car mechanics for example, I think that many times it can be a source of pride to accomplish the task. The pride of a complicated and well-done job in which intelligence must be used, especially when one is interested in the management of the company and one has to contribute to the decisions on how to organize the work, what it is for, what the objectives of that work, etc. I believe that all this can be a satisfying and rewarding activity that, in fact, requires the skills that workers willingly display. But the truth is that I am speaking hypothetically. Suppose there was a residue of work that no one wanted to do, in such a case there is nothing more than to distribute it among all equitably, but for the rest that people freely exercise their talents as they see fit. Peter J., suppose now, Professor, that this residue were very large, as some argue it would be if the work to produce 90% of what we would all like to consume were fully accomplished. In such a case, organizing the distribution of this work on the basis of everyone doing a small part of the dirty or heavy work would be absurdly inefficient. Because for that it would be necessary to train and equip all the people, because they would all have to go through the dirty work, from which the efficiency of the entire economy would suffer and, consequently, the standard of living would be ostensibly lowered. Chomsky, well, first of all we must agree that we are swimming on pure hypotheses, since I do not believe that their percentages are far from real. I have already said that if human intelligence were applied to project a technology adapted to the needs of the human producer instead of doing it the other way around, we would have the solution. Now the inverse problem arises: how to adapt the human being to a technological system devised for other objectives, that is, production for profit. I am convinced that if what I say were done, the unwanted work would be much less than what you suggest. But whatever it is, note that we have two alternatives: the first is to distribute it equitably, the second is to create the appropriate institutions to force a group of the population to do bad jobs under penalty of starvation. Those are the two alternatives. Peter J., I'm not saying forced, but that those jobs could even be done voluntarily by those who considered it worth doing based on a higher corresponding remuneration. Chomsky, oh no, I suppose you've already understood that for me everyone is to receive an equal reward for their work, whatever it is. And don't forget that we currently live in a society where people who do the heavy lifting are no better paid than those who do their work voluntarily. Just the opposite is true. The way our society works, a class society, those who do the hardest, heaviest, or dirtiest jobs are paid the least. These jobs are done, without further ado, but we don't even want to think that they exist, because we know that there is a mass of miserable people who only control a single factor of production, their labor power, which they have to sell, or they will have to accept that kind of work because they have nothing else to do, and rather than starve they are employed for the lowest wages. I accept the correction. Let us imagine three kinds of societies. The first, the current one, in which undesirable work is given to paid slaves. Then a second system in which thankless work, after having done everything possible to make it meaningful, is distributed, and, finally, the third system in which bad work gives the right to extra pay, so much so that for it they agree to some do it voluntarily. As well, I believe that the second and third systems agree in these vague terms in which we are speaking with anarchist principles. Personally, I lean towards the second, but both are totally removed from any current social organization and from any trend towards any social organization today. Peter J., I'll put it another way. It seems to me that there is a fundamental choice, no matter how much one wants to camouflage it, between satisfactory work in itself and work that must be organized on the basis of the value that what is produced has for the people who use or consume it. And the society organized on the basis of giving everyone the same opportunities to carry out their most expensive hobbies, which essentially expresses the formula of work for work itself, has its logical culmination in the monastery or convent, where the kind of work practiced, that is, prayer, is a work of self-enrichment of the work itself. Nothing is produced that is of benefit to anyone, so either you have to live at the lowest standard of living, or you have to resign yourself to starvation. Chomsky, well, here you are making some assumptions of fact that I don't agree with at all. I believe that part of what gives meaning to the work is its usefulness, it is the fact that its products can be used. The craftsman's work makes sense at least in part because of the intelligence and skill he has to put into it, but also in part because it is useful work. I would say the same is also true for men of science. I think that the fact that the kind of work that one is doing serves something else, which is the case with scientific work, as you know, that it contributes to something else is very important, even regardless of the elegance or beauty that one can achieve with their work. I am convinced that this applies to all human activities. I also believe that if we take a look at a good part of the history of humanity, we will realize how many have been those who have derived satisfaction, and not a little, from the productive and creative work they have been doing, but I also think that industrialization greatly fosters that satisfaction. Why? Well, because a large part of the tedious and unattractive tasks can be done by machines, which means that the radius of action of truly creative human work is automatically greatly enlarged. But to something else. You speak of work freely undertaken as a hobby or hobby. I don't judge it that way. I think that freely chosen and executed work can also be useful and important work. You also raise a dilemma that many do, namely, between the desire for satisfaction in and from work and the desire to create things of value for the community. But it is not so clear that it is, in effect, a dilemma and even less a contradiction. It doesn't seem obvious to me, far from it. I think it's false that contributing to greater pleasure and satisfaction at work is inversely proportional to the value of the result. Peter J., I wouldn't say inversely proportionate. To me it might be unrelated. Let's put something very simple like selling ice cream on the beach on a holiday. It is a service to society. It's hot and there is no doubt that the public wants ice cream. On the other hand, it is difficult to see here to what extent carrying out this task of selling ice cream can be a source of professional pleasure or have any meaning, virtue, or social ennoblement. Why would he engage in such service if he doesn't reward you in some way? Chomsky, I'll warn you that more than once I've seen ice cream vendors with Easter faces. Peter J., yes, they were making money by the handful. I think so. Chomsky, and that they seemed very happy to be selling ice cream to the kids, which seems to me a perfectly reasonable and stimulating way to pass the time, compared to other occupations, to thousands of different occupations. Remember that each person has their occupation, and it seems to me that most of the existing occupations, and essentially those that fall into the services classification, that is, that come into contact with others, entail one satisfaction or another and some inherent rewards associated with them, that is, in dealing with the individuals to whom they provide their services. In this case, teaching classes is the same as selling ice cream. I admit that selling ice cream does not require the dedication or intelligence to teach, and perhaps for this reason it is a less envied occupation. But if so, it would have to be divided among all. But all this aside, what I am trying to say is that our characteristic belief that pleasure at work, job satisfaction, or does not have or has negative relationships with the value of the result, is closely related to a particular stage of the social history, that is, capitalism, in whose system human beings are instruments of production. What was said before does not have to be, far from it, the truth. For example, if we review the numerous interviews with industrial psychologists of chain workers, we will see that one of the things they most complain about is that their work cannot be done well, that the chain is so out of control. Hurry, they can't do their job decently. I was recently reading in a gerontological journal a study on longevity in which they tried to find the useful factors to predict longevity, smoking, drinking, genetic factors, they had all been examined. Well, do you know what the most favorable factor is? Job satisfaction. Peter J. Yeah, people who have a nice job live longer, right? Chomsky. Well, yes, people who are satisfied with their work. Which seems very logical to me, since not only do we spend a large part of our lives at work, but it is also at work where we exercise our creative capacity the most. However, what is it that leads to that job satisfaction? I think there are many things, but knowing oneself doing something useful for the community is a not insignificant factor. Many are satisfied with their work because they believe they are doing something important, something worth doing. They can be teachers like doctors, scientists like artisans or farmers. Feeling that what one is doing is important, worth doing, not only reinforces social bonds but is also a source of personal satisfaction, because with an interesting and well-done job that kind of pride is born of those who fulfill themselves, of those who put your personal skills into practice. And I don't think this is going to damage the value of what is produced in any way, but rather the opposite. But let's grant that to some extent it harmed him. When society reaches such a point, the community must decide how to make the necessary compromises. After all, each individual is both producer and consumer, and therefore each individual must take part in these socially determined commitments, that is, if there is really a need to establish commitments. Because I allow myself to insist that the nature of these problems has been greatly exaggerated due to the aberrant effect of the prism that interposes the truly coercive and destructive system of the personality in which we live. Peter J. Okay. You say that the community has to make decisions about possible commitments, but it is no less well known that communist theory completely prevents these possibilities, whether through planning, or in terms of investments, national investment priorities, etc. In an anarchist society, do you think that so much government superstructure would not be tolerated, apparently necessary to make plans, make investment decisions, for example, whether to give priority to what people want to consume or what people want to do in terms of work? Chomsky, I disagree. It seems to me that the anarchist structures, or for that matter those of the left Marxists, based on the system of workers' councils and federations, are enough and are left over to make a decision on any national plan. In the same way, state socialist societies function at that level, let's say national, by having to draw up national plans. In this there is no difference. Where there is, and a great one is, in the participation of such decisions and in the control exercised over them. Anarchists and left-wing Marxists, councilists, Spartacists, make these decisions from the bottom up. It is the informed working class that takes them through their assemblies and their direct representatives who live and work among them. But in the systems of state socialism, the national plan is drawn up by the national bureaucracy that accumulates for itself and monopolizes all the necessary information and makes the decisions. From time to time he introduces himself to the public and says, "You can choose me or that one, but we all form the same remote bureaucracy that is not within your reach." These are the poles, these are the polarized oppositions within the socialist tradition. Peter J. So, in fact, there is still an important role for the state, and possibly even civil servants, the bureaucracy, but what is different is the control exercised over them. Chomsky, well, I don't think, frankly, that a separate bureaucracy is needed to enforce government decisions. Peter J. Various forms of expertise are needed. Chomsky, yes, but let's say that it is an expertise in the matter of economic planning, since there is no doubt that in any complex industrial society there would have to be a group of technicians in charge of drawing up plans, of explaining the consequences of every important decision, of putting in the background the people who have to decide on the consequences of their own decisions as can be deduced from the study and the programming model, etc. But the important thing is that these planning systems are nothing more than industries, with their own workers' councils and forming part of the whole system of councils. The difference is that these planning systems are not the ones making the decisions. They produce plans in the same way that automobile factories produce cars. The plans are therefore at the disposal of the workers' councils and are submitted to the council assemblies, in the same way that automobiles are made to run with them. However, what this system requires is an educated working class. And this is exactly what we are capable of achieving in highly developed industrialized societies. Peter J. To what extent does the success of libertarian socialism, or anarchism, really depend on a fundamental change in human nature, both in its motivation and its altruism, as well as its knowledge and degree of refutation? Chomsky, not only do I think it depends on that, but the whole purpose of libertarian socialism contributes to the same thing, effectively. It is a question of contributing to a transformation of mentality, exactly the transformation that man is capable of conceiving as far as his ability in action is concerned, his power to decide in conscience, to create, to produce and to investigate, exactly that transformation spiritual to which the thinkers of the leftist Marxist tradition, from Rosa Luxemburg, for example, through the anarchists, have always given so much importance. So on the one hand that spiritual transformation is needed. And on the other hand, anarchism tends to create institutions that contribute to this transformation in the nature of work and creative activity, simply in interpersonal social ties, and through that interaction, create institutions that foster the flourishing or emergence of new aspects in the human condition. In short, the setting up of ever broader libertarian institutions to which already liberated people can contribute. This is how I see the evolution of socialism. Peter J. And finally, Professor Chomsky, what do you think of the possibilities today for founding societies as you have just outlined in the major industrial countries of the West in the next quarter century or so? Chomsky, I don't think I'm wise enough or informed enough to make predictions like this. Moreover, I think that venturing into such predictions says more about the personality than the judgment of the person making them. However, perhaps I could say this: there are obvious tendencies within industrial capitalism towards a concentration of power in narrow economic empires within a framework that is becoming more and more of a totalitarian state. These trends have been developing for quite some time, and frankly, I don't see anything that can contain them. I believe, then, that these trends will continue their course as part of the stagnation and decline of capitalist institutions. However, I believe that this recourse towards state totalitarianism and towards an exasperated economic concentration, both things in connection, of course will generate reactions, attempts at personal liberation, social liberation, which will adopt all kinds of forms. A clamor is raised throughout Europe calling for workers' participation or co-determination and even workers' control. For now all these attempts are minimal. Rather, I believe that they are misleading and that they can actually undermine the serious efforts of the working class to liberate itself. But in part they also constitute a pertinent response because they represent a robust intuition and understanding that coercion and oppression, whether made by private economic power or state bureaucracy, are not necessarily part of human life, far from it. The more concentration of power and authority, the more rebellion and greater efforts to organize to destroy them. Sooner or later those efforts will be crowned with success. I hope so. Finish. On the Anarchist Society. Conversation with Peter J. Noam Chomsky.